All right, my name is Jamie Cool, and I'm a program manager in the developer division here at Microsoft. Not surprisingly, I work on the Silverlight project. And we got lots of interesting stuff to talk about. Before we get into it, there's a few housekeeping things I want to get out of the way since you've all been staring at that slide for the last 30 minutes. So first off, yes, my last name is in fact Cool. Yes, it is my real name, I promise. I have only had my credit card rejected once. Yes, I do know that I have a cool last name. And yes, I do, in fact, hear that all the time. So now that we've got that out of the way, I'm really excited to be here. We just finished shipping Silverlight 2, which was probably the most exciting release I have worked on in my 10 years at Microsoft. So I'm really thrilled about that. And it's a really exciting release. You know, we've always been talking about it and showing the really compelling visual, just plain cool things you can do, if I can knock off my last name for a minute. But you know, when I first saw Silverlight and we started talking about it years ago, what really excited me was the potential that I saw for business applications. You know, in one form or another, I've been working on building tools and technologies for developers like yourselves to build business applications and make your lives easier over the course of the last decade. And you know, for the last 10 years, I've listened to you talk about the trade-offs you have to make between the rich interactive experience you can do if you build a client application to the super easy deployment you can do with a web application. And there's always been this difficult choice you've had to make, and it was always very evident that there was somewhere in the middle that we wanted to try and get for this class of applications. And that's what I saw the potential with for Silverlight, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, you know, Silverlight, we haven't really talked about it in the essence of building business applications a lot. We've talked about it from the cool visuals, the cool experiences you can go do, rich media, all that type of stuff. I'm not going to be talking about that today. We're going to talk, first off, about Silverlight as a business app platform. Then we'll talk about what it means to build applications on Silverlight 2 today for solving business problems. And finally, I have a sneak peek of some of the stuff we're working on back in Redmond for a future version of Silverlight in this exact space. Now, one thing I do want to make sure everybody here is aware of, because I know the talk is called Silverlight Futures, and we're going to talk a bunch about that in the second half of the talk. But this is about business-centric applications. If you're here looking to find out about the next cool thing we're doing in video or graphics or any of that type of stuff, you're going to be disappointed. That's not what it's about. In fact, if I tried to show you something like that, it would just be dangerous, to put it mildly. So let's go ahead and get started. I have tons and tons of stuff to show you today. So if we're going to be talking about business applications, let's talk about what do they need, and what do they need that can make Silverlight a good platform for them. Well, the first thing they need are rich experiences. When I say rich experiences, I don't mean, buttons shaped like fishes or things spinning around or the, ultimate animation. What I really mean is interactive UI. Odds are your application has a bunch of data in it. You need users to be able to manipulate that quickly without having to do constant refreshes, without having to do multiple clicks to accomplish a task. You need a very interactive, compelling UI for that type of scenario. The second thing that you need is you need this internet application deployment. One of the projects I worked on was Silverlight, was Click Once, was a technology just for trying to solve this problem for our desktop platform, because people really, really want it for all types of platforms where you can just click a link and the application runs. That's a big thing of what you need. And the third thing you need, application logic. You need a platform that enables you to write the code you need to build your application quickly, because business apps are about getting the job done, accomplishing a goal, and you have to put a bunch of logic in it. That's what separates it a lot from things like display ads or just kind of graphical representations. These three things together form a very defining characteristic for what you want in a lot of business applications, and that's where I think Silverlight becomes very compelling. Now, the way we look at the world, Silverlight 2 just shipped, and it really lays the foundation. We made a ton of progress with it. We went from rectangles to buttons. We went from JavaScript to C# and VB. And it's got a lot of the building blocks you need to build the applications today. We've got the core CLR in it. We've got the base collapse libraries from strings and integers to generics. We've got the XML stack. And 5 different ways to do networking in Silverlight. We've got a whole host of those types of things, and the UI layers come a mile, right? Like we have a core control model. We have a ton of controls that we ship with Silverlight 2, a Silverlight 2 control toolkit that's providing even more down that pipe, but we've got all of the things that you would expect, like layout and styling and data binding. The building blocks are really starting to come online. So Silverlight 2 enables you to build a lot of stuff today, and it lays the foundation for what comes next. So one thing I wanted to address very early is kind of the platform matrix in terms of what you use to build when, especially now that we're talking about Silverlight and business applications. There's nothing really new here. It's the same equation there always is. You have this trade-off between richness and reach. It's just now you have another option. If you need the ultimate reach in the world, then ASP.NET is going to give you what you want. It can run just about anywhere. All you need is a browser. If you need the richest possible experience, then WPF and Desktop Framework is going to give you what you want. It lets you run offline, interact with the local desktop. It lets you build the ultimate rich experience. Silverlight's kind of somewhere in the middle. Doesn't have quite the reach of ASP.NET. It still requires you to have a browser plugin, although by the time all is said and done, we're going to have that everywhere. It doesn't give you quite the UI capabilities that WPF does, but if you're talking about interacting with data and a rich interactive experience, it brings you a long way. So it's kind of that in-between for a lot that's going to be appropriate for a lot of applications. And then there's an orthogonal aspect to this, which is developer productivity. And if you look at ASP.NET, I think by the time you count all of the different out-of-band CTPs we've done, it's probably on like version 18, really. So it's by far and away the most mature of our platform in terms of productivity. Our goal is to get Silverlight and WPF to that same level of maturity. In fact, a lot of what you're going to see and what I'm going to be talking about in the latter half of the talk today is going to be about bringing a lot of the concepts we've introduced in ASP.NET to Silverlight and WPF. And one other note I want to make is that while I'm going to be talking a lot about Silverlight, because this is a Silverlight-focused talk, you can pretty much substitute everything I'm saying in the essence of substitute Silverlight and WPF, and you'll kind of get on the same mindset of what we're doing. Everything we're trying to do here, we're looking to bring to both platforms. Okay, so let's talk about what makes a business app tick. What do you need? What do we have? What are we building for that business application? Well, the real question is, what is a business app? What actually makes it up? It's interesting. You wouldn't believe some of the lengthy conversations we have at Microsoft trying to classify different types of applications, trying to classify different types of application developers. And let me tell you, I love you guys, but sometimes you guys are just unclassifiable in terms of who you are. So since this is my talk, I decided we'd make it really easy. We'll just use my definition. So in terms of what makes a business application tick, business apps are almost universally about working with data, shaping data, manipulating data, and applying business logic to that manipulation of the data. Almost all of the rest of the application revolves around that in one shape or another. So the key things you need to be able to do this break down to, at its heart, a business app needs a way to move data between the tiers, right? You're going to have at least 3 tiers in the Silverlight application between your database, your mid-tier, and your client. You need something to move the data along that path. You need a way to shape the data as it moves along in terms of sorting, filtering, that kind of stuff. You need a way to bind and display the data in the UI. And then finally, you need a way to soundly apply business logic to that data. Now, I say soundly because there are about 1,001 ways to apply and to insert business logic into an application like this, and about 3 of them are actually sound. So that's one of the things we're going to be talking about today as well. So let's start off for the next 15 minutes. Let's just talk about what does it mean to build one of these applications with Silverlight 2 today. Moving data, case 1. You need a way to move data. So we have a bunch of different options in Silverlight for moving your data around. The first is we have an integrated networking stack, which means you want to pass cookies, we'll pass the cookies along. You logged into a website in your HTML page, it established an auth cookie, that'll get passed when you do your Silverlight networking. We have an integrated networking stack that does that. You can make direct HTTP requests with it. On top of that, we have a complete web services stack. So you can use WCF to build REST or SOAP-based web services, or to call them, all the way from doing the simple add web ref that you're used to in Visual Studio, where you have a web service, you just add ref, and now you can call it in a strongly typed manner, all the way to consuming REST and plain old XML with the web client interface. So lots of kind of simple, straightforward, traditional .NET ways of getting the data. Now, we also have more advanced cases, so cross-domain. All networking, as most of you probably know, in Silverlight is restricted to the same domain that it comes from, because it's just not safe to do cross-domain networking requests. You could run an application that when you're running inside of your intranet, it talks to your email server, gets your email, then sends the data back to the site that it came from. It's not safe. So by default, it's restricted, but we have a way that you can specify a config file on a server. So if the server is not an email server, it can say, it's okay for cross-domain clients to talk to me. So that's a way to get above that restriction. And if you're talking about two-way communication, you want to be able to do not just downloads from the server, you want to be able to push data from the server to the client. We have two different options. We have sockets, which is the to-the-metal way to go about getting it. It gives you all the control in the world. Now, the downside with sockets are that it's a little bit more complex from a programming model perspective, and you start to suffer from firewall and proxy issues. So there's also something called WCF duplex. If you're not familiar with WCF duplex, what this is essentially a messaging queue-based programming model that you use between your server and your client. What the client's actually doing is a regular poll-based to go back to the server and look for new messages, but it gives you a very message queue-based programming model. And the nice thing about that is that it will tunnel through HTTP, so you don't have any of those proxy or firewall issues, and the programming model is pretty straightforward. The WCF team feels really good about this technology and thinks it's enterprise ready for people to use in their applications today. And finally, the last one I wanted to mention was AD.NET Data Services. You may also know it as Astoria, which was its code name for a while. This is a great way if all you want to do is take a database, expose it to the web, whether the web's your intranet or your internet or whatever, as REST-based services. It's a great way to go about doing that. So if that's your scenario of exposing data via REST, you should look at AD.NET Data Services. But we're going to start with our first demo. And what we're going to do over the course of the next hour is we're going to build an application from start to scratch. And we're going to start with some building blocks that we've got in Silverlight 2, and we'll play around with some of the future stuff a little bit later. So the first thing I want to do is build an application that can move data back and forth. So we're going to be building an HR application. It's got a list of employees. You can download employees. You can manipulate. You can edit them. You can promote employees, fire employees, all that type of scenario. Very traditional type of application. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a new project, and we're just going to make a Silverlight project, and we'll call this guy HR Demo. And this is just using the straight vanilla Silverlight 2 RTM bits that are available. Now, there's lots of different ways to go about building this application. If you were a UI type of person, you might start from the top down and build the UI and work your way down. I'm more of a traditionalist, so I'm going to start with the data layer and work my way up. So we can use whatever data layer we want on our server. We could use AD.NET Entity Framework. We could use D-Link and Hibernate. AD.NET, if I didn't say that one. Really, any data access layer you can choose from, it would work. Any of the ones that exist today, any of the 6 we have scheduled to ship next year will also work in this scenario. So I'm going to go ahead and, for this demo, use, how about Entity Framework? So we're just going to make an AdventureWorks data model. Since, as far as I can tell, we have exactly 3 databases in all of Microsoft. I, feeling adventurous, will choose AdventureWorks. And we will just select the employee table, let that finish. And I have a simple data layer that it exposes the employee table. All right, so that's step number 1. Now, step number 2, if I'm building this kind of application, would be to do what? To add a web service in all likelihood, right? So in this case, we're just going to do a SOAP-based web services because we're in the concept of the business application. And we'll go ahead and add one of these. And we could add whatever kind of web service we want. We could do an ASMX. In this case, I'm going to do WCF. And we'll just call this guy the employee service. And we'll ignore that error. And all I'm going to do for this is give it an operation contract. So what this is going to do is return back a list of employees. And we'll just call this method getEmployees. And we'll go up to our employee service here, and this will define the implementation of that guy. And we'll call this get employees as well. And then down here, in terms of the implementation, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the entity framework data layer. So we'll new up our data layer, and we'll call this AdventureWorks. Oops, type ahead, getting ahead of me. All right. What did I do wrong here? Oh, give that person over there a prize. I will remember you. We'll just call this guy A because we're having trouble here. There we go. And we'll go with A dot, and let's say that we want to get our employees. But let's say because there are a lot of employees in AdventureWorks, we want to just filter this guy down. We can use link on the server. We can just return only the salaried employees, for example. And we'll just return that guy. Now, let's see if that builds. All right, we are. I love you guys. Now, we are using a flexible WCF service. So Silverlight likes basic web services. So we will set the basic into the config file. And now, if I want to consume this guy, I'm just going to go back up to our Silverlight application, and we're going to add a service reference, discover the one in our project, call this guy employee service. So in terms of error fixing, I'm going to go with this root side of the room is up 2 to nothing, I think, is my current score. Oh my. Did we not fix the build error? There we go. All right. 2 to 1. 2 to 1. Okay. The one thing I will promise is plenty of opportunity. I fine you 1 point. 2-0. Okay, now that we have our service reference up at the top, we can go up and let's just add a reference. And now I can call my web service really easy. I can come down here and let's just hook up the loaded event. Down here in our loaded event, when the page is loaded, we will new up one of these services, which in this case is called the employee service client is the class we're calling this. We'll just call this WS. And then to call this, all I have to do with WS dot get employees async. Easy enough. Now, everything in Silverlight in terms of the networking stack and download is async, of course. So if I want to know when it's done, I can just do WS dot. Oh, okay. Now you guys are just messing with you. I'm going to figure this one out myself. Okay. Okay. There's a W missing. Okay. All right. I'm going to give you both a bonus point from that. 3-1. WS dot get employees and completed. All right. Now we come down here. Now what do we want to do? We want to display the data in some way. So we will add a data grid, and I hope I can drag and drop today without screwing that up. So we'll add a data grid, give this guy a name, and we'll call this guy data grid 1. And we'll go back to our code. And then down here, what I want to do, simple data binding, data grid 1 dot set its item source to be, in this case, the result of the web service call. And now if I run this, and let's just make sure we get rid of default size so we can see it all. And there we go. We're getting back all those list of employees from our server and displaying it in the Silverlight data grid. Now, this is the Silverlight data grid that just shipped. This is actually one of the first pure business application building blocks that we provided. And we kind of started out going after business applications for Silverlight, and we realized there were things like data grids that were missing that we needed. So we got a bunch more we're working on, but this is the first one. But it means, I can scroll through data in a web page, which is kind of cool. I'm not usually used to doing that. It's got the whole resize of columns. I can move columns around and reorder them. I can resort the data. All that stuff's kind of cool. So this one's available today. But this is kind of the baseline. You can get data. This is the simple form. There's lots of different ways to get data in Silverlight. Now we should talk about displaying data. We've done kind of the bare bones level, level 0 of displaying data. Now, nice thing about Silverlight 2 is we have a custom control model. So whether it's displaying list of data or individual entities of data, you can build your own custom control and make it and display it however you like. Or we have a series of controls that we provided out of the box. If you're talking about list controls, we have the data grid, which I just showed you a quick example of. We have an items control and a list box if you want a fully customizable experience with how you want your data to look like when you're listing it. We have the whole set of standard date time picker, calendar control, text box, radio button, that whole set of controls for showing your data. And we have a controls toolkit that's available now that provides the next set of controls, including a set of very interesting ones for building business applications like tree view, like charts. And if you're interested in finding out more about this, Sean Burke has a lunch talk tomorrow. He'll go into a lot more detail about the control toolkit for Silverlight. And of course, all this stuff is fully stylable as you would expect. Now, data binding. Data binding was one of the big new additions in Silverlight 2. We have a good chunk of the WPF data binding in Silverlight today. One way you can bind any CLR object that supports iNotify property change, which is the interface that says, hey, I've changed an object. You can do two-way binding, so we can push changes back down from the UI into the application, into your OM. We have value converters if you want to do converting or formatting as part of the data bind. And we have the very first level of hooks in place for validation. So if you want to find out during the data bind itself that something went wrong, you can listen to the error, find that out, and then take appropriate action. And there's a bunch more things we're working on in the validation space that I'm going to give you a preview on in a little bit. And of course, collection binding. So we have the full set of controls that I was talking about before, but you can use the data template concept if you want to really customize your UI look as part of the data binding and templating approach. So let's take a quick look at that. So let me switch back. Let's say that I wanted to go about styling this application. Now, let's start with just the data grid. Now, what I'm going to do here, I could open this up in Blends or something like that, but I'm just generally dangerous in those tools, so I'm not. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my app XAML, and I'm going to add a few things to the app XAML. I'm just going to throw in, first, just a couple of namespaces. And then second, I'm going to throw in this big block of XAML that I don't understand half of it, to be perfectly frank. But luckily, my designer, or at least my designer plus Blend, completely understand what it is. And let me just put it in our resource section, and I'll show you what it is. All it is a set of resource styles. So, if I wanted to have a border style that looked kind of metal borderish, that did all of these things down here in terms of gradient stops and stuff, that's now declared. So if I want to go use it, I can just go over to my application and set on my data grid some of those styles. So I'm just going to go pick one that I've already set those on and replace our data grid. And it's the same exact data grid. The only difference is I've set some of the things like the row style and the column header style from the library that I picked up from somebody slightly more creative. And to show you just some basic, making the data grid look and feel a little bit different in terms of it's got the interesting selection model and the different color scheme. But it's just an easy way to, with just a few more lines, apply different looks and feels as you go throughout it. Now, if you really want to start customizing this type of thing, you could start looking at using a list control. So I'm going to add one of those real quick. Let's get rid of our data grid. And let's go add a list box. And we'll call this guy list 1. And then we'll go update our data bind so that list 1 is what we update. Now we run this. Be the same thing, except I've got a list box instead of a data grid. Now, the list box is going to be just displaying the default string for each of the employees, which is completely uninteresting. If you really want to start customizing this, what you would do is you would create a data template. So if we go back here, and we want to customize this, we would add an item template. And an item template is just basically defining what XAML look and feel should we have for each row in our list box. And inside of the list item template, we will add a data template. And inside of the data template, we're just going to make a stack of new controls that we're going to bind. So we'll make a stack panel, and we'll orient that horizontal. And inside of here, we'll throw in a few things like a text box, and how about a date picker. Now what I want to do is bind these. So in my code, if you remember, what I'm doing is I'm binding my item source to my result. I'm binding the list of employees to the list box. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bind each individual control to a field on that list set of employees. So I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to set my text property to be bound to my employee ID. And I could come in here and I could start doing things like the binding mode two-way and setting all those types of things. But for right now, I'm just going to do it real simple. And we'll set up the date time picker the same way. And we'll bind this to the hire date. Or was it birth date? Oh, we'll go with birth date. And now if we run this, we get something that looks a little bit more interesting in terms of having the employee ID over here and the date time picker with the birth date. And you can see very easily that it doesn't take a lot to customize that experience. So if I throw in a piece of XAML, a slightly more complicated piece of XAML that has all that formatted, you can get the classic contact card type of experience really easy. And you can see that type of thing going along with that. So again, these are building blocks in terms of what you can do with basic binding, basic controls along the way. Now, the next step would be shaping data in terms of reading XML, writing XML. We have a whole bunch of functionality in Silverlight for doing this today. We have XML reader, we have an XML writer as a baseline, we have an XML serializer, we have a JSON serializer, we have link in the box, xlink, link to JSON, link to objects. So if you want to just do manipulation of data, either on the server like you saw me doing, or on the client like you saw me doing, we have a whole ton of capabilities of that in the box. I'm guessing probably everybody here has seen link to death at this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to skip over this demo a little bit because we go through it, we reshape it. And instead what I'm going to, we apply a little filter, reshape it a little bit. Instead, in the essence of time, we're going to jump to some of the stuff that we're playing around with in the future. So, what would I really like to do next to my application? If I got my basic, can read some data, display the data, what I'd like to do next is make the data updatable, right? I'd like to be able to actually edit the data. To do that, I have to add some new web services that I could call and hook up. And if I wanted to update more than one employee at the same time, I'd have to deal with diff tracking and change that tracking on my client and sending diffgrams across the wire, that kind of stuff. Validation, I'd really like to be able to just say, these set of fields for an employee are required. This one has to be between a particular range. Here's some custom code to run whenever you want to validate a particular field. I'd like to be able to do data paging. I only return salaried employees in my example. If I had to return all of them, then I would have gotten back a whole ton of them. If there's 50,000 employees coming back, odds are I don't want to download them all at the same time. I want some model for paging over the set of data and some infrastructure for doing that. I'd like to be able to do server-side filtering. I'd like to be able to search and sort my data, but have that be applied on the server, especially if I'm talking about doing data paging. I'd like to be able to do authentication. Like compare and contrast ASP.NET authentication with what it would take for me to do this on other client technologies. With ASP.NET, the experience is drag a login dialog into your application, and you're largely done. And it's hooked up to the authentication service in the back end. What you'd like to be able to do with this, you'd like to be able to get that same type of experience with Silverlight. And I'd like to have a more fully featured UI. I'd like to be able to create apps with more than one page. I'd like to have the pages be a little bit more involved. I'd like to be able to do that. So I'd also like to be able to apply business logic. This is a real business application. I'm going to have business logic for when I'm manipulating employees, for when I'm running my own custom definition of what it means to run my business. So all these things are what I'd like to add next. And we could go and do this, and you could watch me do it for the next hour, and it would probably be about 87 to 53 by the time it's all said and done. But all of that would be work, and I'm kind of uniformly against that. So what I decided instead of that is, let's talk about the future stuff we're working on and how some of those concepts could fit in. So here's the way I view the world in terms of the Silverlight component stack. We've got a base platform. The base platform has the core execution engine, the CLR. It's got the core UI engine, right? Those are the things that make everything go. Those are the things that without them, you couldn't do any of this stuff. It took a long time building up those core pieces. The next level of the stack is kind of a base framework piece, the kind of building blocks, a lot of what we've been talking about. Things like networking, data shaping, the controls, the control model, data binding, a whole ton of other stuff that are there today. But these are some of the ones that are the most interesting for Silverlight applications. Now, there's a whole ton of these, a whole ton of more things we're going to be doing in all of these stacks. One of the things we're playing around in the base framework stack is a navigation model, and what might that look like for Silverlight. Other things we're playing around with are something slightly different, a more vertical stack, right? Something that's more oriented towards a particular class of application. In this case, Silverlight and WPF-based business applications. So in the more vertical orientation, things like a framework for how you plug in business logic, a framework for how you plug in validation, so you can define your validation logic once, and it'll flow all the way from your business logic tier to your data tier up to your UI tier without having to re-author it 3 times in a row. Data loading, so scenarios like filtering data or paging data from the server to the client. You don't have to go plumb through 18 different ways through all of your web services in your middle tier. Application services like authentication, roles, user settings, making those accessible and easy to consume in your application. And business controls. Data grid was a great example. There are other ones that we're working on and playing around with in this context as well. So there's a whole series of things that are much more kind of vertical towards a particular class of applications. So I have one more slide that I want to show you before I jump to the demo. And that's about the business logic framework, because everything else that I'm going to be showing you, you're going to get right away. You're going to understand what it is. This is a little bit different. This is something we haven't done much of in the past, where we're actually trying to tackle the business logic problem and how you go about authoring business logic. So, traditionally, what we give you is we give you the view up top with your client code. We give you the data tier at the bottom with plenty of choices for you to choose from. And then in the middle, it's kind of, we give you those service technology, but it's up to you in terms of how you shape it and implement it, and it's kind of freeform in a lot of ways. What we're working on now is, what we're playing around with is, business logic patterns that if you follow our pattern, it'll be one that will grow with you, and it'll be one where if you follow the pattern, you're going to get a bunch of infrastructure help along the way where we're doing a bunch of the things that are really just plumbing behind the scenes for you to make your lives easier, but in a way that's not trying to hide the middle tier from you, not trying to hide the fact that you need real business logic, you need a way to have a 3-tiered application. So that is really what we're trying to go do. And one of the key aspects about it is that you have this business logic layer, but it straddles both the client and the server space, because really your business logic does, right? You define the master copy of it on the server, but you invoke it and you manipulate it the most from the client. So you need something that kind of keeps them in sync. So it's a lot easier to show you than to talk about. So let me give you a demo of that. So we're just going to close this project. And instead, we're going to start over building our application, but we're going to take it much further. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this project, which is largely empty. It's a little bit pre-populated with some design content for a demo, but it's largely an empty Silverlight project. And what we're going to do is we're going to build that same application. We're just going to do it slightly differently. We're going to first add a data tier, and the data tier is exactly the same because we're not doing anything in the data tier space. We have plenty of those. So we'll just add our database layer to our application again. And now what I'm going to do is, instead of adding a web service, I'm going to, really what you want to do now is add your business logic, add that middle tier layer. So we're actually going to formalize that a little bit more. So in this case, I'm going to add a new item. And I'm going to add a business logic class. And we have several of them that are wired up to talk to different data layers more ideally, but they can talk to anyone, any data layer that they want. And we'll just call this HR business. And inside of HR business, we have a business logic class. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hook up our HR business class so that it's wired up to talk to the data layer that we just created. And you'll notice first that it's got this attributes, enable service access equal true. We have a whole, in this prototype, we have a whole ton of data access and business logic access control parameters, right? Because you want to be able to lock down your business logic to say this isn't available to clients, or this is only available to clients that are authenticated or that are authenticated enough of the manager role. And you want to be able to apply that to individual methods on your business logic. There's a whole model for doing that. And you want to be able to, so let's take that. And now the next thing we want to do is we want to just return our list of employees, kind of step number one like we were doing before. So we're going to just uncomment our hello world method here. And you can see that this is a select method. The select method is an attribute that's basically declaring that you're following our pattern and how you're going to get a bunch of the infrastructure along the way. And we'll call this get employees. And here we're just going to use the same EF code, so we could get the EF context, and we can just return employee. And now, just by building that, without having to do anything else, I can go back up to my client tier. And I don't have to do any add reference because the client and server are just kept in sync. I can go ahead and just instantiate that business object automatically. And then if I want to download the employees, I come down here and use this. I can see there's an employees collection that will contain all the employees that we're going to download. There's method like load employees because it's kept in sync between the server and the clients because there was a get employees and now I have a load employees. And there's methods like submit changes for when I want to make changes back to the server. In this case, I'll just call load employees. And of course, all this stuff is async, so I can hook up the loaded event. And we're going to just skip to having all of the things that I'm going to be doing for this demo styled already. So we're just going to go up. We're just going to go to our XAML, and we'll put in a data grid. And it's just the same data grid with the same styles and a little bit more margin and formatting and that kind of stuff. And then to hook it up, we just set its item source to be our business object employees collection. And we'll to-list that just for the heck of it. And now if I run this, I get very much the same experience with a set of employees coming back, except they're plumbing through this business logic model. Now, let's start taking advantage of that fact that we're going through this. In this case, I'm getting back all the employees. Let's say that I wanted to get back just the salaried employees again. So and we'll change this to be get salaried employees. And now if we go back to our client, you'll see that load employees is giving me a squiggle because it's not there anymore. Instead, load salary employees is there because that's what we actually have on our back end as well now. Right? So they're being kept in sync as part of this. Now, this load logic is really trivial, right? It's not really doing very much, but load logic can get really complicated, right? Like paging by itself makes loading very non-trivial. So to solve that problem, we've been playing around with something called a data source. If you're familiar with ASP.NET data sources, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Basically just a component that's encapsulating a bunch of this functionality and problems for you. So if I blow away, let's just get rid of all the code that I've written so far. And if instead we go back over to our XAML, and you know what, I'm just going to throw in a little bit of formatting, because we're going to be building out this application a bit. Just all I did was put in some columns and a bit of background that, again, I picked up from somebody else. And now what I'm going to throw in is a data source. So the data source is basically saying, hey, I'm a data source. That HR business object is the object that knows how to load data. Type of data to unload is employees, because the business objects can have all kinds of data on it. And that load salaried employees load method is the one that actually knows how to load stuff. So the last thing I've got to do to use this is actually just bind this to my data grid. So all we're doing here is setting the item source of the data grid to be bound to our data source.data, which is what's exposing the actual data. So now if I run this, get a slightly prettier UI, because I updated that, and we get the same data with absolutely no code. Now, that is interesting, but where it gets more powerful is, let's say that I wanted to do something like, in my data source, have a sort. So by default, when the data source first loads data, it should sort the data by the employee ID in a descending direction, for example. Well, let's say that we wanted to make the data pageable. So throw in a new control we've been playing around with called a pager. So we'll put the pager right above our data grid. And the pager is simply bound to the data source the same way the data grid is. And now when we run this, you can see it has a page size set to 13. So now when we run this, we have an app with our list of data that I can now page over without having to do anything else. Now you'll notice there's a flicker, right? And that flicker is because I'm paging over the data on the server. And that's an important aspect here, right? Because we're not pulling down all the data to then page over it. And what's making this possible is if we go back here, you'll notice that we have in our business logic layer, our get salaried employees method is returning an iQueryable. That iQueryable basically gives us the power to issue an iQueryable is kind of like the translation of the link query. And basically what we're doing is we're able to serialize that across the wire from the client to the server, execute on the server, send the results back, which is how we're able to page over the data this guy's exposing. But this, again, is still, it's building up to more complex loading logic, but you can make it even more involved. You could come in and you could say on the data source, let's make it so that whenever you load, let's set the load size to be 26. And that just tells the data source, whenever you do load, at the bare minimum, load at least 26 items, right? And in our case, that would be the equivalent of 2 pages of data. So now, I can page over page 1 and 2, and it's instant because I got those 2 pages in memory. And I go from 2 to 3, there'll be a flicker because I went to the server again. 3 to 4, I already got them because I have 2 pages. And if we go back to page 1, think about what would happen if I hit sort here, right? I don't want to just sort over the pages I have in memory. I want to sort over what's on the server, right? Because the sort and filters and paging, they all kind of collide in odd ways, and it gets complicated quickly. But in this case, the infrastructure takes care of it for you, so I can just click on this. It'll do the resort, and it'll get the first 2 pages of new sorted data back from the server for me automatically, right? So that's kind of cool. Now, that is the first set of just getting the list of data going. Now what I'd like to be able to go do is make the data editable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in another chunk of XAML. And this chunk of XAML is basically a list of controls, labels, and text boxes with a little bit more XAML that's turning on some validation logic. And the main thing here is that there's a new data form control, which think about this as a details view. We're hoping to get it to that point eventually, similar to the ASP.NET details view, so we can take an entity and go about making that UI very simple to do, very simple to consume. But for right now, to hook it up, all I'm going to do is go back to go back to our code, and we're going to hook up the data grid selection changed event. We'll just hooking up the currency here, so that when the selection changes, the data forms data context is changed to be the data grid's selected item. So now when I run this, I see I get my details view off on the right, which is kind of nice. But we also, because we have the default validation UI turned on at this point, I can come in here and say, vacation is an integer field. We can do basic type checking out of the box. So if I put in, some characters, it's going to give me some validation errors. You can tell we've been playing around with different design semantics. Your eyes aren't actually twitching. The text boxes are moving. I know you're all thinking that. I'm pretty sure we're not going to ship that, but it's kind of a cool thing to play around with in the spare time. Yeah, it's good for demos. 3, 0. So that's default validation. But what you'd really like to be able to do is apply custom validation, right? I'd like to be able to say, the vacation has to be between 0 and 80 hours, otherwise it's not valid, or it has to be required, or I have to run custom code. Now, what you'd like to be able to do is go back to our project and say, here's our data layer, AdventureWorks, right? If I open this guy up and I look in here, this employee class is really my master definition of my employee. I'd like to just come down here in my employee class and slap on some attributes onto employee ID that says it's required, and have that just populate all the way up the stack. We can almost do that. The one catch here is that this is a designer-generated file, so mucking with it is kind of a no-no. So for this particular data layer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the official Microsoft workaround for this solution, for this problem, which is to add a code file. Just call it AdventureWorks. We'll call it AdventureWorks metadata. Well, it doesn't really matter, but I will give you half point for that. 3.5 to nothing. What's that? You're just out to really drag your team down. Okay. So what I'm going to do is basically just throw in some effectively the partial class workaround for doing this. The nutshell is I have a place where now I can apply vacation hours that will be mapped to the real employee class vacation hours field, where I can literally just come in and say, this field should be required. Or this field requires a range of 0 to 80. And now this will be enforced all the way from the server up to the client without having me have to write any more code. And if I rerun the application, the client-side validation will pick that up. So if I come in and try to give this guy 110 vacation hours, he in fact can't get 110 vacation hours, and you see that it has to be between 0 and 80, right? And of course you can use resources and conditional formatting and all that kind of stuff. And you can apply shared code as well that will follow the same rule, as long as that shared code is code that we can run on both the server and the client. This is one of the powers of the fact that we actually have the same programming model on the server with .NET and on the client with .NET in Silverlight. It's one of the big advantages of that model. Now, this still isn't actually editable yet, right? Now I want to be able to edit this guy. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down and I'm going to go back to our business layer. Because our business layer, all it's doing is it's got a select method that returns employees. The server itself doesn't support editing the data. So following this pattern, I'm going to add in a new method called the update method. And the update method, again, is just following the pattern, saying an update method, using the entity framework to actually save the data back to our database. And now from the business logic layer perspective, that set of employees are editable. All I have to go do is add a save button to our UI and hook it up. So we'll go throw that in our XAML down here at the bottom. And we're going to the data source, so just like it basically is exposing the functionality of the business object, so we can call submit changes. And that will send back to the server all of the changes you've made to your list of employees in this case when it's called. You can edit multiple of these at the same time if you want, and we'll send back the diff. So if we come in here and let's say that we wanted to give this guy 5 vacation hours, make him active. I can click save. I didn't hook up any confirmation UI. I could have, but now if I close this and run it again, I've got data flowing all the way between the 3 tiers very, very simply and very, very easily. Thank you very much. Now, let's say I want to do some business logic. Let's say that I wanted to go and I can flip this bit to be inactive and click save, but that would be a really, really impersonal way to fire someone. So we're going to build a fire employee method. And I swear, I did not pick fire employee because of the current business conditions. It does turn out, though, that the AdventureWorks schema does not encourage promoting employees. It does encourage firing them. So that's what I ended up having to go with. So we're going to make a business logic method. What we're going to do is go back to our business logic layer, and we're going to add something called a domain method. And all this domain method is doing is, on the server, it's just updating my data layer to say, the current flag should be false. But if I wanted to run, real business logic, let's say that I wanted to send emails or kick off a workflow so that, his network account gets shut down when he leaves, we can go do that as part of this. And this business logic will now be available to the client to invoke whenever it needs to. So let me just add a using statement here. So now if I go back to our UI, I'm just going to add a fire button so we can invoke that method right next to our save button. So our fire button, and down here we will new up an employee. We will call him unlucky. And we will get the current employee from our data forms, current data context. And then on unlucky himself, we have a fire employee business method, just kind of flowing up between the server and the client. And just like you would queue up all of the changes you would make to the data on the client, when we call submit changes, all of these domain methods would be invoked on the client, sent back to the server as well to be executed. So now if we run this, I can come in here and I can click the fire button, and you'll notice that the active bit should flip because it got changed on the server, and I don't have to do anything else because all 3 tiers of the data is just flowing and being kept seamlessly in sync, right? So that's an example of adding business logic to the system. Now let's say I want to go a little further. Let's say that every application I build wasn't really just a one-form application, because they aren't. Let's say I wanted to have, say, let's be rebellious, a 2-form application. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to this design content folder where I have a couple pages already made. I have a home page, and I have a new root page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the root page, and this is going to be kind of the master navigation page that will be able to navigate between the other 2 pages. So on the root page, what I'm going to add is a frame. And this frame, think iframes, and you won't be too far away. But basically, I gave it a name, gave it a home page, and whether we should show its default navigation UI or not. In this case, it's turned off. Then it's going to add a stack panel with 2 buttons in it. The 2 buttons are navigation buttons. Navigation buttons, basically their purpose in life is when you click me, I will navigate a page. In this case, the employee button will navigate to the employee list XAML page, and it'll navigate to the HR frame, which was the name of the frame up here that we just added. So if we go reconfigure what our home page is to be that new HR root, you can see now I have an application with a home page with 2 buttons up top. I can go to the employee list page, and I'll go to the page that we just built. If you're paying attention, you'll notice the URL just changed, and you'll notice that the forward and back got grayed out, so I can click back, and I can go back inside of the same Silverlight application. You can also cut and paste this URL and mail it to someone. They can open it up in exactly the same place that application was at. Let's say that I wanted to log in, authentication, that kind of thing. Wouldn't it be great if we could get to the point where, turning that type of stuff on for an application was as easy as adding a authentication control to your application? Because we're using ASP.NET we're using the web server on the back end, we have an auth service already running with ASP.NET. So we can hook up directly to that. This is using Forms auth. So I can come in here, and hopefully I can type the very, very secure minimum password. And that logs me in, and I get a nice login experience, and it knows who I am. Because we've extended the played around with extending the app object, so it's very easy to get identity from like app.current.user, something like that. Wouldn't it be nice if we could map this functionality with the business logic, right? Where, what if when I go to the employee page, I don't want people to be able to get my list of employees unless, they're logged in and they're logged in as a manager, right? Because it's kind of sensitive information. If we go back to our business logic class, and we just add a namespace here. And we come down here. Let's say that I don't want to be able to return the employee information unless, all right, there we go. Unless I am authenticated, or let's say unless I'm a member of the manager role, which my login is. So now if I run this, and I don't log in, and I go to the employee page, I'm not going to get any data back because I'm not logged in. It's not letting me have access to it. If I go back to the home page and log in, again, typing the super secure password, and now I go back to the employee page, I should hopefully get my list of employees because I'm logged in. So that's kind of an integration between all the different features. So that's a quick preview of some of the things we're playing around with. I did want to emphasize super, super strongly that this is kind of a sneak preview of some of this stuff. Lots of things are going to change. There'll be other things. There'll be things taken out. The whole scoop for that. But this is, the kind of essence of one of the new places we're trying to take Silverlight with these new types of applications, and we think there's a lot of potential for them. Just a few more notes before we go. A couple other things that we are working on. You saw me authoring lots of XAML because I didn't want to switch over to Blend for business app design talk, business app talk. But we are working on making the VS editor inside of the XAML editor inside of VS editable for Silverlight, adding design time data support, a bunch of things along that front. There's going to be lots more Silverlight controls. Sean Burke's doing a good talk to talk about that tomorrow at lunch. And there's lots more core platform enhancements we're going to be talking about in the future that I haven't even begun to touch on. Additional Silverlight talks. Seema's doing a good deep dive on building optimized graphics-intensive applications later tonight. Sean's talk I already mentioned. Olympics was really a really big deal for us inside of Microsoft. A whole bunch of folks really rallied around that. A lot of folks put in a ton of hours for that. It was a really big accomplishment. If you want to see some more insight into what went into that, there's a talk on Wednesday for that. And then the control talk that Karen's doing is probably the most interesting in terms of next level of detail of things that are relevant to this class of application. And Karen will do a good version of that on Thursday. Last couple things. So number one, Silverlight not perfect for every business application. Still lots of uses for ASP.NET, lots of scenarios for the desktop. But it's going to be useful for a large class of them. So I'd encourage you to consider using Silverlight for your next business application. And the second thing is, if some of the newer things that I was talking about and showing you today were interesting, and it sounds like something that you might be interested in playing around with, giving us some feedback, send me an email, and I'll see what I can do to get you hooked up with some early previews of some of this stuff. With that, I will open the floor to questions. Thank you very much. I'll start over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering how you'd wire NTLM authentication up to something like that.
The question is NTLM authentication, Windows off. We've played around with that too. It makes it easy from the user experience perspective. It's not about logging in, logging out, because you're largely going to be automatically logged in or logged out as part of the web page for most browsers. What does get interesting is in the case where you need to get access to the credentials. And that's where just what you're interested in Windows Auth is getting access to the current user information. That's really that scenario. And we're looking at that as well. Okay, thanks. In the middle?
Hi, Jamie. It was great to see all this stuff about data today. One of the things that's not in Silverlight right now is support for data sets, data tables, things like that. And we have a very robust, well-tested web service that returns data sets. And it does so largely because our data is very dynamic, and you can add columns on the fly to data table and things like that. And I have to still digest some of what you showed. I'm not certain that you could do that even with this architecture you showed today. But are there plans for adding data sets to the Silverlight platform, like it's in compact framework, it's in everything else, it's just not part of Silverlight yet?
Yeah, dataset is something that we've looked and prototyped a bunch with Silverlight. It's just kind of been a resource trade-off. So what I would encourage you to do is send me an email that acclaims your love of datasets, and I will +1 it to the people that were responsible for it.
Okay, great, thank you.
No problem. Over here.
In the example you did, was the business object talking directly to an ADO.NET entity?
Great question. So in the example that I was doing, the business object layer was talking directly to the entity framework code. So the context is wired up directly to that. There is no abstraction whatsoever of the data layer in what I showed.
Now, if I have a WCF service that's returning an employee object, which is not necessarily an ADO.NET entity, just a class, would something like the HR business object help me in things like tracking changes in the front end?
Yeah, so that's a scenario we've been looking at and playing around with. It's good to hear you asking that question. It's one of the things we've been wondering about, like how interesting those types of scenarios are. Definitely a ton of the pieces that I showed you on top, on the top half of the stack, the validation UI, navigation, all of those things are kind of independent entities. So those, if nothing else, would give you a lot of value. But I'll say I'll +1 that scenario back to the team in terms of that scenario.
Okay, so it's something that you're looking at, basically.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
Back here.
One thing I haven't heard talked about is the printing story. What can we do on the client to actually print out data?
That is a great question. Printing, what are we doing in printing to help with that? Joe, do you have any particular insight for me to add to this other than, we've heard it before, we hear it a lot, we want to solve the problem, we're thinking about when's the right time to do that?
We're working on solving the problem. The only thing I'd add.
Yeah, and we're working on it. It's a matter of kind of when exactly it ships. But there's definitely a well-understood need for better printing support in Silverlight.
Well, just let me point out what's really important to us is to print to a dot matrix printer. I know we have to print to a dot matrix printer. We have to print to government forms, which we've already had the layout for, but we have to print on a dot matrix printer. So keep it in mind.
Okay. Okay. Joe says his team will be working a little longer on that problem. Okay. Middle.
Okay, two things. First, authentication, having that in line with the identity roadmap, Geneva, et cetera, more than just forms auth?
Right. So all of the auth stuff, again, a lot of the principles you see in ASP.NET map to a lot of the things I'm talking about here.
Okay, I was assuming that.
So in that model, it's very provider-based in terms of how you do it.
That's
Same exact model here.
Perfect.
Yep.
Second part, what kind of numbers of controls are you targeting? 100 controls on a page? 1,000?
In terms of supported controls, how many you can have?
I mean, obviously you have some kind of design goal in mind.
Well, I think it's probably more, Joe could probably answer this one a little bit better, but I think it's more a question of number of elements.
Exactly.
Simple controls, thousands. If you have controls that have thousands of elements themselves, you'll start to hit a fewer control boundary quicker rather than later. Yeah. Yeah, so the key point that Joe is making is that Seema's got to talk right after this, and a lot of what she's going to be talking about in terms of optimizations, high graphic stuff, is us building controls and learning our lessons about how to do it right, and what the right numbers and balances are for that. So she'd be a great person to talk to about that.
2 questions. One on data binding. Do we have any plans to support data binding to anonymous types, the types that you're creating on the fly using LintQ on client side?
There's a ton of scenarios in the data binding space that are on the plate for us to get to in the future. That one, I believe, is also one of the ones we've been talking about. You're not just talking about UI to UI binding. You're talking about declaring your own type dynamically.
Right.
Basically,
building the data grid and stuff on the dynamically, right? Number of columns are not known at run. It will only be known at runtime. So right now everything in XAML, it's fixed.
Right.
We want to build the whole thing dynamically at runtime.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I think it's another one we've heard before, but no. Unfortunately, I'm just kind of giving you a sneak preview of a few of the things we're working on. I'm not really talking at great length about when and what's coming in the next version of Silverlight.
Well, and something definitely to consider.
Yep, definitely.
Other thing was I saw a lot of validations.
A lot of what?
The validations that we declared right now, right? We did the validation on the client side and the server side.
Right.
Are you thinking about having it selectively so we can do some sort of validation only on the client side and something else on server side? I mean, right now it seems like everything is occurring on both the sides.
Yeah, so the validation scenario, you absolutely have a model in our. The validation I showed you today was shared. It was actually the really simple case, which is you have attribute based where you want to bubble the attribute up and down. There's actually scenarios where you want to write validation code that's server only because it needs to do server lookups or what have you. Or it's a less common scenario, but there are scenarios where we want to do client only stuff as well. And that is definitely part of the model we've been working on.
Thank you.
Yep.
Jamie, this morning Scott showed us taking Silverlight out of the browser. Is that part of this futures framework? Or is that something else? Totally
orthogonal thing.
Okay.
Right now, all the thing I'm talking about is focused about Silverlight in the browser.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
I know this was about Silverlight in particular, but a lot of those attributes that you were using, I don't know if I'm ignorant of those or if that was part of the future things that you were talking about, but as far as being able to put an attribute for like a range or the permissions, is that going to apply to will that also apply to things like ASP.NET or WinForms?
So the answer to that is it actually already applies to some of those.
Okay.
ASP.NET, if you're familiar with the dynamic data feature of ASP.NET, uses that today. And what we're doing is we're leveraging that as well as part of our model. So you can go into ASP.NET dynamic data and declare those types of attributes, and that affects what it produces. So all of these are sharing those back-end pieces between the different technologies inside of Microsoft.
Okay.
Yep. I'm going to take one more question, but then I'll hang around to answer as many as we got. Go ahead.
Is there a roadmap or a time frame for the release of the next version?
There is not a timeline or roadmap that we're talking about yet. Stand by. All right, thank you guys very much. I'll hang around if you got any more questions.